"Can I help you, old-timer?" The voice was sharp, laced with the kind of arrogant impatience that came from a man who believed he was the smartest person for 100 miles in any direction. Bryce, the lead civilian engineer, strode across the wet sand, his expensive boots leaving neat temporary prints. He stopped before the old man, planting his hands on his hips. "We're a little busy with billion-dollar hardware here. This isn't a VFW meeting." Walt York said nothing. At 84, he'd learned the value of silence. He kept his hands tucked into the pockets of his worn jeans, his gaze fixed not on the puffed-up engineer, but on the monument to futility half swallowed by the Florida surf. The Sea Titan, the Navy's newest amphibious assault vehicle, was beached. It sat there like a metal whale, groaning under the rhythmic slap of the incoming tide, its state-of-the-art systems dead to the world. Walt's faded blue Navy ball cap, weathered by decades of sun and salt spray, was pulled low, shadowing eyes that had seen machines far older and far more stubborn than this one. Behind Bryce, a team of a dozen engineers and sailors swarmed over the vehicle, their frantic energy a stark contrast to Walt's stillness. They jabbered into headsets, laptops open on portable stands, their screens filled with cascading lines of diagnostic code that all amounted to the same conclusion: nothing. "Security," Bryce barked, turning his frustration on the only person not actively failing to solve the problem. "Get this man off the beach. He's in a restricted military test zone. He's a security risk." Two young shore patrol officers, barely out of their teens, approached Walt with a practiced reluctance. They saw a frail-looking senior, not a threat. "Sir, I'm sorry, but this is a restricted area. We're going to have to ask you to come with us." "License and registration, Pops," Bryce sneered, enjoying the show. "Let's see who you are." The confrontation escalated as the small crowd of beachgoers kept at a distance by a line of yellow tape began to murmur. They could smell the injustice in the salty air. Bryce continued his tirade, his voice rising over the sounds of the waves and the panicked shouts of his team. "Look, I don't know what you think you're doing here, but whatever you did in your day, it's over. This is a different league. This machine has more processing power than the entire Apollo program. The tolerances are measured in microns. You wouldn't understand the first thing about its multiphasic hydrostatic transmission." He used the technical jargon like a weapon, designed to belittle and exclude. Walt remained impassive. He had heard louder noises from smaller men. The tide was creeping higher, now licking at the massive tracks of the Sea Titan. Every minute the vehicle sat there, the risk of it being swamped and ruined increased exponentially. The pressure was immense, and Bryce was cracking under it, his professional veneer dissolving into raw, ugly pride. He pointed a trembling finger at Walt. "He's probably a spy for the Chinese. Look at him, just watching, taking notes." The accusation was so absurd it hung in the air, ridiculous and venomous. The senior shore patrol officer sighed. "Sir, we just need to see some identification." Slowly, deliberately, Walt reached into the back pocket of his jeans. He pulled out a worn leather wallet, the kind that molds itself to a man's life over half a century. It was cracked and soft at the edges. He didn't hand over his driver's license. Instead, his gnarled fingers, stained with the memory of grease and oil, retrieved a small object. It was a brass gear, no bigger than a quarter, its teeth worn smooth, its surface tarnished with age. He held it in his palm. Bryce let out a short, derisive laugh. "What is that?" "A souvenir from your little tugboat. A prize from a crackerjack box. Get him out of here." For a fleeting second, as Walt looked at the gear, the bright Florida sun vanished, replaced by the dim, pulsing red light of a battle station. The air, thick with the smell of diesel and fear, was filled with the percussive slam of enemy fire against a steel hull. He was 20 years old again, crammed into the engine compartment of a Higgins boat off the coast of Korea. The engine was dead, the ramp was stuck, and the Marines huddled behind the bulkhead were sitting ducks. A young Walt, his face smeared with grease, held that very same brass gear. It wasn't a standard part. He'd machined it himself from a wrecked Jeep's distributor, a desperate, ingenious piece of battlefield engineering. He slotted it into a mechanism he'd jury-rigged, his hands moving with a certainty that belied the chaos around him. He gave it a final turn, and with a cough and a sputter, the engine roared back to life. The gear wasn't a souvenir. It was a promise he'd made to himself. Never again would a machine's failure cost a man his life if he could help it. Back in the present, the shore patrol officer looked from the gear to Walt's calm face, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He was saved from having to act by a new voice. "Stand down, sailor." The voice belonged to Captain Hayes, the officer in charge of the beach exercise. He'd been watching the entire embarrassing spectacle unfold through a pair of powerful binoculars from a command tent set up on the dunes. He'd seen Bryce's childish outburst, but more importantly, He'd seen the old man's unnerving calm. He saw the way the old-timer wasn't looking at the vehicle, but through it, as if he were reading its very soul. Something wasn't right, and it wasn't the stalled machine. Captain Hayes lowered his binoculars and picked up his satellite phone, punching in a number that went straight to the top. The phone was answered on the second ring. Admiral Thompson's office. "This is Captain Hayes at the Juno Beach test site. Get me the Admiral, now." There was a pause. Then the deep, impatient voice of the 4-star Admiral in charge of the Atlantic Amphibious Force came on the line. "Hayes, what's the problem? My aide said it was urgent. Don't tell me your 21st century marvel is being defeated by some wet sand." "Sir, that's just it. It is. The Sea Titan is completely stalled. The civilian engineering team is stumped. Diagnostics are in a recursive loop, and the tide's coming in." "But Admiral, that's not why I'm calling." "Then why are you, Captain? There's a civilian on the beach, an old man. Bryce, the lead from Omnitech, is giving him hell, accusing him of espionage, trying to have him arrested." Hayes paused, trying to find the right words. "Sir, there's something about him. He's just watching. He hasn't moved an inch. He just stands there, looking at the machine." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "What does he look like, Captain?" "Old, sir. Maybe early 80s. Thin. Wears an old blue ball cap. A Navy cap." Another pause, this one charged with a strange energy. "Hayes, ask him his name. Do it discreetly. Get me his name." Captain Hayes motioned to his aide, a young lieutenant. "Go down there. Get that man's name. Don't make a scene." The lieutenant jogged down the dune, spoke quietly with the shore patrol officer, and jogged back, his face pale. "Sir," he said, slightly out of breath. "The old man, his name is Walt York." Hayes relayed the name into the phone. "Admiral, his name is Walt York." The reaction was immediate and explosive. All the impatience in the Admiral's voice vanished, replaced by a sound Hayes had never heard before: awe. "My God," the Admiral whispered. The sound was faint but clear over the satellite link. "Hayes, are you telling me Walt York is on that beach right now?" The scene cut from the sun-bleached beach to a stately office in Norfolk, Virginia. Flags stood in the corners, and intricate models of warships lined the bookshelves. Admiral Thompson, a man whose presence usually filled the room, now seemed small, clutching the phone to his ear as if it were a holy relic. "Hayes, listen to me, and listen carefully." The Admiral's voice was now a blade of pure command. "Your new orders are as follows. You are to ensure that no one, and I mean no one, bothers Mr. York. Place a security detail around him, not to detain him, but to protect him. Offer him a chair, a cold drink, anything he wants. But do not, under any circumstances, let that arrogant punk engineer near him again. Am I clear?" "Yes, Admiral. Crystal clear." The Admiral hung up and slammed his hand on his desk intercom. "Commander, get me a Seahawk on the helipad now. Scramble it. Top priority. I want a flight plan cleared to Juno Beach, Florida, yesterday. And get me the Secretary of the Navy's office on secure comms. Tell them I've found the ghost in the machine." His aide, a young commander, stared at him, utterly bewildered. "Sir, the ghost?" The Admiral was already grabbing his formal cover from its stand. "Before you were born, Commander, there was a man at Navcia, a civilian engineer. He designed the powertrains and transmissions for nearly every amphibious vehicle we built from the Korean War to Desert Storm. The man was a legend, a myth. He could diagnose a stress fracture by the sound a gear made. He could remachine a bearing with a hand file and a can of oil. He retired 30 years ago, and the institutional knowledge that left with him was immeasurable. That man's name is Walt York, and my prize-winning engineering team is currently trying to arrest him." Back on the beach, Bryce saw Captain Hayes' aide speaking to the shore patrol, who then backed away from Walt with a newfound deference. This only inflamed Bryce's ego. He mistook the change in tactics for a victory. He strode back over to Walt, his face a mask of smug triumph. "All right, Grandpa. Time to go," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "We'll have you escorted off the beach. Maybe a nice quiet room to wait in while we figure out if you're a spy or just senile." He gestured for the shore patrol to move in, but they stayed put, their eyes fixed on the dunes. Walt finally broke his silence. His voice was a low rasp, dry from the sea air, but it cut through Bryce's arrogance. He was speaking almost to himself, his eyes still on the crippled machine. "It's the harmonic dampener," he muttered. "It's out of sync with the torque converter's fluid coupling." Bryce overheard him and let out a bellow of laughter. "Harmonic dampener. Torque converter. This is a fully electric hydrostatic system. There is no torque converter like in your old jalopies. My God, you're just making things up now. You don't have a clue what you're talking about. You are a relic." It was the final fatal overreach. It was the moment his pride completely eclipsed his reason, and it was at that exact moment that the sound began. A low, rhythmic thumping from out over the ocean. It grew quickly, from a faint pulse to a deep, chest-vibrating chop. Everyone on the beach, the engineers, the sailors, the onlookers. Bryce looked up. A sleek black MH-60 Seahawk helicopter was screaming towards them, flying dangerously low and fast. It wasn't a standard transport. It had the markings of a VIP command bird. It didn't bother with the designated landing zone far down the beach. Instead, it flared into a hover just yards from the crowd, its rotor wash whipping up a furious storm of sand and sea spray that sent papers flying and forced everyone to shield their eyes. The side door slid open. A figure appeared, silhouetted against the bright sky. He didn't wait for stares. He jumped from the skid to the sand, landing with the solid thud of a man in command. He was immaculate in his dress, whites, the 4 stars on his collar gleaming in the sun. It was Admiral Thompson. He completely ignored the billion-dollar sea titan. He ignored Captain Hayes, who was running up to meet him. He ignored the stunned engineering team. His eyes scanned the scene for a moment, and then locked onto the old man in the faded navy cap. He began to walk, his stride purposeful, direct, cutting a path straight through the chaos. The entire beach went silent, save for the idling chop of the helicopter. Bryce stood frozen, his mouth hanging slightly open, the color draining from his face as he watched the highest-ranking officer he had ever seen in his life march directly toward the old man he had just publicly humiliated. Admiral Thompson stopped precisely 3 feet in front of Walt York. He snapped to the most rigid, formal position of attention Bryce had ever witnessed. His right hand came up in a salute so sharp, so packed with respect, it seemed to vibrate in the air. "Mr. York," the Admiral's voice boomed clear and strong over the helicopter's whine. "Admiral Thompson, it is an honor, sir." Walt slowly, almost reluctantly, lifted his gaze from the machine and met the Admiral's eyes. He gave a slow, tired nod of acknowledgement. It was enough. The Admiral held his salute for a long moment before dropping it. "Sir, I was a young ensign on the USS Iwo Jima when your York modifications to the LVT-7s kept my entire company from getting stranded in a squall off the coast of Lebanon. The old hands told us you did the final calculations on the back of a napkin. You saved us then." He turned his head and his gaze, now as cold and hard as polar ice, landed on Bryce. "This man," the Admiral announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the beach, "is Walter York. He holds more patents on amphibious drivetrains than any other man alive. He single-handedly redesigned the transfer case on the AAV-7A1 with a set of wrenches and a notepad, adding 20 years to its service life. The prototype that you geniuses can't get to move." He jabbed a finger toward the Sea Titan. "Its core power coupling principles are based on his graduate thesis from MIT. 1968. You, Lieutenant," he spat Bryce's civilian title like an insult, "are not worthy to carry this man's toolkit." A wave of comprehension washed over the crowd. Jaws literally dropped. The junior sailors looked at Walt with a newfound reverence, as if he were a figure from history who had just walked off the page. The 2 shore patrol officers looked at each other in horror, realizing how close they'd come to putting handcuffs on a living legend. Bryce's face had gone from pale white to a sickly shade of green. He looked like he was going to throw up right there on the sand. The Admiral took a step toward Bryce, his shadow falling over the disgraced engineer. "You are the lead project engineer. You had a living resource, a national treasure, standing right here, and you treated him with contempt. You saw an old man, not the mind that built the very ground you stand on. You are relieved of your post on this project, effective immediately. Report to Captain Hayes. You're on latrine duty until further notice. Maybe scrubbing toilets will teach you the humility you so clearly lack." Yes, Admiral," Bryce stammered, his voice a pathetic squeak. Admiral Thompson turned his back on him, dismissing him from his reality. He faced Walt again, his demeanor softening instantly. "Mr. York, Walt, I am profoundly sorry for the reception you received from my people. Can you—" He pointed a steady, gnarled finger at the Sea Titan. "You over-engineered it, son," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of authority. "You put in so many redundant digital safeties they're fighting each other. The computer thinks the transmission is failing because of a momentary pressure spike, so it triggers an emergency lock. But the pressure spike is being caused by the computer preparing to lock it. It's a feedback loop, a snake eating its own tail." He turned and looked directly at Bryce, not with anger or triumph, but with the weary patience of a teacher addressing a student who had missed the most fundamental point of the lesson. "You have to get your hands dirty sometimes, son. A computer can't feel a vibration that's off-key. It can't smell overheated fluid. It can't hear a resonance that's out of pitch. Your machine has a soul. You just have to be quiet enough to listen to it. As if to punctuate his point, Walt reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, tarnished brass gear. He held it up for the Admiral to see. This came from the first prototype that ever failed me. Busan, 1952. A tiny flaw in the casting. It sheared a pin and left 24 Marines exposed on the beach. I never got their names. His voice grew distant, haunted by the memory. I kept this, to remind me that theory is one thing, but a life depends on the metal, on the parts you can hold in your hand. The gear wasn't a trophy of success. It was a token of failure, a constant, humble reminder of the stakes. With the Admiral at his side like an honor guard, Walt walked over to the silent metal beast. He ignored the complex digital interface panels and the rows of blinking lights. He ran a hand along a seam in the armor plating, then knelt down, his old knees protesting with a faint crackle. "Pop that access panel," he said to a young, eager-looking sailor standing nearby. "No, not that one. The manual one. Behind the exhaust manifold. The one the diagnostic schematics don't even show." The sailor, wide-eyed, grabbed a pry bar and did as he was told. With a grunt, he popped open a small, forgotten plate. Tucked inside was a simple mechanical bypass valve, a beautifully machined piece of steel that looked like a relic from another era. It was an analog solution in a digital world, put there by an old-school engineer deep in the design process, a man who knew that one day the computers would get confused. "Turn that valve a quarter-turn counterclockwise," Walt instructed. "All the way, you'll hear a click." The sailor reached in and turned the valve. A loud, solid clunk echoed from deep within the machine, followed by a satisfying hiss of equalizing hydraulic pressure. The entire vehicle seemed to sigh in relief. Walt nodded slowly. "Try it now." The Admiral relayed the order with a frantic wave. Inside the cockpit, an engineer, following instructions, initiated the startup sequence. The Sea Titan, which had been inert for hours, roared to life with a deafening blast of power. Its massive tracks churned, digging into the wet sand, and with a lurch it pulled itself free of the surf's grip and climbed onto the dry beach. The entire shore erupted in a spontaneous roar of cheers and applause. The following week, a memo was disseminated from the Office of the Secretary of the Navy. It was distributed to every engineering command and defense contractor. It established the York Principle, a new doctrine mandating a formal consultation program with retired veteran engineers for all major new hardware development projects. Bryce was quietly reassigned to a remote monitoring station in Attic, Alaska, a career-ending post where the only thing he would engineer was his own regret. A month later, Walt York was in his usual booth at a small diner just off the beach, a cup of black coffee steaming in front of him. The bell over the door chimed, and Bryce walked in. He wore a simple t-shirt and jeans, the arrogant swagger gone, replaced by a heavy quietness. He saw Walt, hesitated for a moment, then walked over to the table, holding his own cup of coffee. "Sir, Mr. York," he began, his voice low. "Is this seat taken?" Walt looked up from his coffee, his expression unreadable, and gave a slight nod toward the empty seat across from him. Bryce slid into the booth. He didn't offer a fumbling apology. He just looked at the old man and said, "You were right. I was listening to the computers, not the machine." Walt took a slow sip of his coffee. "Machine's got a story to tell," he said, his gaze drifting toward the window and the ocean beyond. "Same as a man. You just have to be quiet enough to hear it." They sat in silence, the space between them filled not with animosity, but with the shared unspoken language of engineers, a bridge finally built between two different worlds. Walter York's quiet wisdom reminds us that true expertise is not always loud, and the greatest strength is often found in humility. If you were inspired by this story of unassuming valor, please like this video, share it with a friend, and subscribe to Veteran Valor for more incredible stories you won't find anywhere else.